remarkable in communication and business development roles, including his time at the Tri-City Cancer Center. He is a certified destination management executive and currently serves as an adjunct professor for Heritage University. Michael obtained his MBA from WSU, and we joked that he graduated summa cum laude from WSU as well. Michael, did I miss anything?
I think you nailed it. Thank you.
Perfect. Our other guest today is Mike Gonzalez. He currently serves as the Economic Development Manager with the City of Pasco. His previous background in the newsroom and government communication provides him a perspective on earned media and getting to the heart of stories and messaging that is really unique to him. Little did Mike know that when I befriended him on the Pasco Little League fields that I'd be volunteering him to join us for some of our PRSA programming. Mike, did I miss anything? Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, that's great. And we always had fun at the ball games. And Jess is very friendly with everybody. She's a great mom out there. I felt like my wife was really hard on my son, you know. So, but it's great to be here, and it's great to see a lot of friendly faces. So I feel like I'm amongst old friends. Great to see my old news director, Joan Lucas, in here, who, you know, from a management perspective, learned a lot from her during my time at Cap KVA DC. So great to see my energy friends in here. So I think you nailed it. You know, my lens really comes from a journalistic perspective, and I think, you know, there's so many crossover elements, whether it's public relations, marketing, and all those things kind of intertwine, especially on the news front. So been able to utilize some of those skill sets. So, you know, I really hope you can get a few nuggets from me, and it's worth your time.
Wonderful. Well, before we begin, I'd like to mention that my colleague, Mike Paoli, is manning the chat box in today. Since we have so many mics, I'm going to refer to him as Mr. P and operating in the background today, so we don't confuse anybody. So throughout the conversation today, if any questions come to mind, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. He may interject throughout the conversation. If not, we'll hold him till the end. So again, thank you all for joining us. So starting off, Michael, I'd like to start with you from a community outreach perspective. What are some of the characteristics of the larger subcultures here in the greater Tri-City region? And what kind of obstacles do subcultures, does your organization, do you personally encounter here in the greater Tri-City region?
Yeah, such a great question. So for the larger subcultures, and I should mention, and this will probably come up during my presentation too, it isn't just along ethnic or racial lines. We've got subcultures that exist in art and anything that somebody might have interest in. So for us, as we're working with businesses to promote those activities and amenities to points outside the Tri-Cities, many of the larger subcultures actually have some level of organization or structure to them. So it makes it a little bit easier to get connected. But when we look at tourism and hospitality assets and amenities in the makeup of our community, one of those groups that we like to talk about but has limited resources, and this is one of the challenges, is really our Black community. So when we look at Black-owned businesses that really do fit under that tourism and hospitality umbrella, there's far fewer of them. And so the connectivity is something that we personally have been working on. You'll see a little bit of this during my presentation. Matter of fact, just this last week, as we're working on hospitality recruitment, we had a Black-owned business. One of the owners had allowed us to kind of use her travels throughout this her career path to demonstrate what a career in hospitality could look like. So there's some good opportunities there. I wrote an article for it's called Anthropological Tourism, and I'll put a link in the chat box a little bit later, but it tees up some of the history related to our Black population here in the Tri-Cities as it really goes back to World War II and what that story is. And it's those types of things that I think allow us to deepen relationships, create understanding, and then we can build these collaborations that have great community impact.
Wonderful. Thank you. Mike, same question to you.
Yeah, when I look at the subcultures of the Tri-Cities, I always say everyone has their own lens. So, you know, I grew up in Miami, Florida, really diverse community, spent my life, you know, you try to be unbiased in the news business and transitioned into the energy space, and now as an economic development manager. So I kind of look at this question from kind of multiple perspectives. I look at the Tri-Cities, really, I mean, there's, like Michael mentioned, there's that art subculture, but when I look at really the dominant subcultures, it's really Hispanic and white. You know, I'm seeing that the Black community is on the rise, and they certainly want their voice heard, where we're seeing that in Pasco. Like Michael mentioned, there's a rich history for Black Americans in this part of the Tri-Cities. So they definitely want to be recognized. And from an economic development perspective, we certainly are. But when I look at the dominant, it certainly is Hispanic and white. You could even break that down further when I look at Hispanics in general. So you have a first generation Hispanic, which is an older, more traditional. Their communication consumption is really kind of the traditional newspaper. They like to consume their media in Spanish. They like Telemundo, Univision. You know, my generation between 30 and 50 years old, I look at those as really second generation Hispanics. These folks are more educated. English is their primary use language. They can consume Spanish, they're bilingual, but they actually prefer to consume their media in English. Very proud of their Latin and Mexican roots, but you know, they consider themselves really Americanized and acculturated. What I'm seeing is really this third generation Hispanic. You know, this is a younger Hispanic. English is their primary language. The majority do not know how to speak Spanish, yet they still maintain those strong ties to culture, nostalgia. They love Mexican heritage, consume all their media in English, and very heavy users of digital. That's certainly what we found when I was in the news business. The other subcultures here in Tri-Cities, obviously white. So, I mean, we've kind of got a bifold of these subcultures, the way I look at it. Then I further look at it, how we looked at it in the news business. You have white, highly educated, Hispanic, highly educated, then white and Hispanic, really rural and blue collar. So these, you know, whether it's I'm in the energy space, marketing, conscious from an economic development perspective, that's kind of the dynamics I look at the Tri-Cities as.
Wonderful, thank you. Mike, I'll start with you on this question. Can you please describe really the high level strategy that the city of Pasco is taking right now in outreaching to the subcultures that you just mentioned?
Yeah, when I came on board to the city of Pasco, the thing that I could see, you know, we really had an image problem essentially. There's a lot of great things that are going on in Pasco, but I think there's sort of the reality and some of the misinformation that has been pervaded over the years for whatever reason. So I think for us, I mean, the first thing that we had to do was really start telling the region, the state about the great things that we were doing. So that was really one of the first things that I wanted to do. So when I came on board, you know, we met as a staff and, you know, to get some of the initiatives that we wanted to get out. And you know, you really have to be honest with yourself when you're evaluating your organization and your messaging strategies. So it's interesting. I rely on, you know, I played baseball at NC State for a really good coach, Ray Tanner. You know, this guy is moved over to the University of South Carolina, won a couple of national championships after he left NC State. But he would always tell us, perception is reality, man. Perception is reality. So, you know, I think there was some certain perceptions about Pasco which necessarily aren't true, and perhaps we had to work hard to change those. So that's what I'm doing. And my strategy, you're going to have to work really hard to do it. There's no magic bullet. And I think sometimes we, as public relations people, news people, marketers, we want sort of this magic formula as to what's going to work. So the first thing I did was I really researched with constituents. I spent my first month, exhaustive hours talking on the phone. I talked with Michael Novakovich, who's in this meeting. to really figure out what the outside perception of Pasco was. The other initiative was really talk about uncomfortable subjects. One thing I wanted to do was figure out how the marketing felt. Marketing and public relations sometimes is a feel. So one of the things that was extracted was many felt like the marketing efforts in downtown had felt really uncomfortable. These were hard conversations, especially with my Caucasian friends. The feeling really was, if I'm not from Mexico or I don't speak Spanish, I don't necessarily feel like I want to go to an event that's sponsored in the city of Pasco. So those were tough conversations to hear. So, how do you pivot and make those adjustments? I work closely with the Downtown Pasco Authority. So we had to figure out, are those people getting value from Downtown Pasco Authority, and what can we do to enhance that? And then the final element is really taking action. So what I did was really create a content creation plan to where I was going to get out as much as I could. My goal is 8 content pieces a month that market some element of the city of Pasco. Form the Pasco Business Advisory Council, where we've got 30 members or so. The next initiative, market more in English, regardless of what subject I'm talking about, whether it's a Mexican restaurant, a dress store, or some other content piece. So I think that gives it more of an inclusive feel. And then the final strategy is really change our language when we post. I've been really trying to market our downtown core as more of an international district than what is perceived as a Latino district. So we could already see it feels better, if you will, to a lot of people, and that's the feedback that we're getting right now.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing that. Michael, how about you? Can you describe some of the high-level strategy you guys are implementing at Visit Tri-Cities?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering if I should save that for my presentation, because I'm going to dig into it. So if you've got another,
go for it. I think this is a great opportunity. I think that ties in great with some of the additional questions. So go. I'm opening the door for you, Michael.
Awesome. I'm going to do a screen share. So much of what Mike was just keying up on is really some strategies that we use, but I think they're effective for all of our relationships. And it certainly works when we're talking about communicating across our communities and building collaborative endeavors, which when you look at Visit Tri-Cities, and if I had some time to really dive into this, we run a lot of committees and councils, but it's a ton of collaboration, and it nets great results for our entire community to enjoy. What I wanted to chat with you about was successful cross-cultural communications. And Mike was really leading into this. We really need to have an understanding of culture. We're going to take a dive into these things, develop partners, tap into the talents of our teams. That's the value of a diverse workforce. Relevant and relatable messaging as professional communicators. I know this is part and parcel to what we need to do. Use the appropriate channels, proactively seek feedback, refine messaging. We've got to be present. And if we do all of these things, we can establish trust. And with that trust, we can build these collaborative relationships and go out and do some incredible work for the benefit of everybody who calls the Tri-Cities home. Well, the first stop is culture. We need to really understand what other people value, what their beliefs are, what their social norms or mores are, but also the taboos. Because if we bump up against a taboo, the walls of good communication are going to come up, those barriers, and we're never going to cut through. So when we look at these shared beliefs and values, one of the things that we really need to remind ourselves is it's shared beliefs and values amongst those cultures. But what can we latch onto that are commonalities for us? The thing that we want to avoid is ethnocentrism. And I think all of us would probably steer clear of that full first bullet, the belief in the inherent superiority of one's own ethnic group or culture. And that would be the idea that maybe my way is a better way. The things that you're doing are antiquated or archaic. At the extreme end of this is Nazi Germany. I think the place that we can unintentionally find ourselves is in the middle of that second bullet, and that's a tendency to view other ethnic or cultural groups from the perspective of our own. Mike mentioned the lenses, the filters that we look at life through, our perceptions, and they really do become our reality. And if we don't recognize that there's differences between the cultures that we're talking to, and again, ethnic and racial cultures, we've got some primary concerns there, but we also have all of these other things that are subcultures of the Tri-Cities where people have interests and they've got their own unique culture. But sometimes we apply what we believe is our truths that is accepted by everybody. And if we're doing that, we're introducing cultural bias. Linguistics is one of those things that can happen. When I was doing my MBA, I was teamed up with some international students, and I quickly found out that English isn't English. They brought their culture and their meanings and applied it to words that were very, very familiar to me. And of course, I'm using my meanings and sometimes slang, and it led to some miscommunication. We needed to get on the same page. We need to be aware of these things, ethical concepts of right and wrong, understanding facts or evidence-based proof. There's a lot of things that can lend itself to cultural bias, the miscommunication. If we do that, we'll never establish trust, and we're never going to get as far as collaborating with people. So when I was at the Cancer Center, I joined the team in 2012. I was part of their exec team, serving as the Director of Strategy and Business Development. And right out of the gate, I did 2 commercials. One of them was called The War on Cancer, and I'll talk about that here in just a moment, just a little bit of it. But the other one was this CEO message. So for those of you that happen to remember the news cycle in 2012, we have Rand Wortman over on the far right. He was the CEO at Cadillac. They were not yet owned by Prov. Far left is Glenn Marshall. He was the CEO of KGH. It wasn't even called Trios at that time. And in the middle is John Searle. There was a contentious battle playing out in the local media for what's called certificate of need or hospital beds between Cadillac and KGH, and it was bloody. But all 3 of these CEOs served as board of directors, and I got to see the work that they were doing for the betterment of our community. They were collaborating at our table to do good work for those people we were providing care for. So I created a commercial. I did it in English, but we knew we needed to communicate to our Spanish-speaking friends. There's a lot of late incidents of cancer occurring in the Hispanic population. So here's what I did.
Los directores generales de Catholic Health System, Kennewick General Hospital y Lourdes Health Network, todos están de acuerdo en una cosa. El Tri-Cities Cancer Center es nuestro centro principal para atención de cáncer, a la par con las clínicas nacionales de cáncer. Es su salud, es su elección. Elige su Tri-Cities Cancer Center. Contacte al médico que lo refiera. El Tri-Cities Cancer Center es una asociación de Lourdes Health Network, Kennewick General Hospital, Cadillac Regional Medical Center y la comunidad de Tri-Cities.
So if we had more time, I'd ask you to kick on your microphones and tell me what was my miss. Actually, you'd probably tell me miss says, right? So here's the deal. Nobody would know that I had a limited budget or that everybody that was in that commercial was actually employed by the Cancer Center. And we did not have a very diverse workforce at that time. If I was in our Spanish-speaking population and I saw this commercial, here's what I would notice is that I'm seeing the lips moving on these CEOs, and it's not an overdub. It was a voice over, right? There's one continual voice, but it obviously wasn't built for me. The original message, you heard all 3 CEOs, and then all 3 CEOs talked about the value of the Cancer Center. You would have heard their voices. You would have recognized them sharing this understanding that we're providing quality care. Instead, for our Spanish speakers, they saw something that wasn't built for them, obviously, and then they look at this video that doesn't have anybody that looks like them. They can't see themselves in it. If I were to rewind the clock to 2012, I might have carried the message forward, but it would have looked completely different. So I quickly realized that I didn't know what I didn't know, but I certainly need a partner that did know the best way for me, for my organization to communicate with our Spanish-speaking population here in the Tri-Cities. So I encourage you to develop partners within the cultures, the communities you're working to engage. So I reached out to somebody I knew who understood good communication, but also our Hispanic community. And it was Albert Torres, who owns 2 Decitas. I figured, here's a marketer, right? And a business person. I bring him into the Cancer Center. I told him asked him actually to educate me, but I told him, here's our need. We're finding late stage incidents of disease in our Hispanic population, and we need to communicate with them. We recognize there's an access to care issue, meaning that some of these folks don't have insurance, but we can take care of that. We're going to take care of them at the Cancer Center. What Albert told me was, he says, Michael, there's an additional issue you've got to contend with, and there's a health literacy problem. We don't talk about breasts or colons or prostates. You're going to have to do a level of education. But here's what he told me that really stuck with me. He says, don't dip your toe into this. He says, if you're really interested in having meaningful impact, commit to it and stay in it for the long haul, because you're going to need to show up and they're going to need to get really familiar with your organization and your message so that there's a level of comfort with it, not just familiarity, but comfort, which will lead to trust, which will allow us to do the things that we need to do, get people connected to screening and treatment. I also recognized I needed to deepen my network within this population if I was going to be successful. So enter Martin Valadez. Many of you might know Martin. He's a friend of mine, but we had a fledgling relationship back then. He was my counterpart at Tri-Cities Community Health. And Martin and I partnered across our agencies to do a year-long campaign on colorectal health awareness to the Hispanic community. So what I loved about partnering with Martin is he had a network, and he reached out to a gentleman named El Primo, who is a regional personality on TV, and I think he may occasionally do radio as well. He's a rock star in this community. And so when El Primo shows up to any event, it doesn't matter what it is, people flock to see and hear from El Primo. Well, he helped us carry this message forward. So we did this for a year. It was a sustained campaign, really working on health literacy and an understanding of why people need to be screened, because we were losing a lot of our Hispanic neighbors to late-stage colorectal cancer. Following this, it led to a community-wide collaboration for the first of its kind colorectal cancer pre-screening program amongst many entities, including our area hospitals, but there was a lot of people involved in it. We knew we needed to advertise in English and Spanish. It's one of the few times in my career that I scripted something in English that literally translated to Spanish, and we could keep the commercial as is. It was going to be relevant. And what was really crazy about that is we used humor, which humor doesn't often translate. But in this instance, it did. I want to show you that clip in Spanish.
No te fijes en mí, me la estoy pasando bien. Soy un pólipo que vivo en tu colon. Sí, dije colon. Lo más probable es que pase desapercibido a menos que obtengas una colonoscopía. ¿Tú no quieres molestarte con una colonoscopía? Esas cosas en realidad pueden prevenir el cáncer mediante la eliminación de pólipos precancerosos como yo durante el procedimiento. Tú y yo tenemos historia. Estamos conectados y yo solo puedo causar tu muerte.
Manténgase sano. Se ha revisado, programe su colonoscopía hoy.
So for those of you that don't speak Spanish, that would be myself included. Here's the English version.
Don't mind me. I'm just hanging out. I'm a polyp that lives in your colon. Yeah, I said colon. I'll most likely go undetected, unless, of course, you get a colonoscopy. You don't want to trouble yourself with a colonoscopy. The darn things can actually prevent cancer by removing precancerous polyps like me during the procedure. Now, what fun would that be? You and I have history. We're connected, and I just may take your life.
Be healthy. Get screened. Sign up for our free colorectal cancer pre-screening event today.
Hey, in the interest of everybody on this call, if you're over 50, we're concerned about your health and wellness. Even here at Visit Tri-Cities, go get your colonoscopy. So what we're really talking about is cross-cultural communications. And if we're going to be successful in this space, of course, we need to recognize culture as we had that lead in. But what are the commonalities, the shared values, shared truths that we can leverage? This is true of any relationship. But probably more importantly, what are our differences? And those are the things that we need to speak to. So here's some thoughts for you on how I believe and how we operate in this space to be successful. It needs to be relevant to the receiver. I think we all understand that as communicators. If it's not relevant, it's going to be tuned out, right? So it needs to be authentic. It needs to reflect values and interests. So here I have a picture of a Hispanic family, emphasis on family, enjoying a meal. This culture values family. And this is something we need to understand as we're communicating with any culture. Where are their values? We use active listening. I'm not going to walk you through the active listening wheel, but it does mean that we do more listening than we're doing talking, like 80% of the listening, 20% of the talking, asking open-ended questions, probing questions. But here's where the rubber meets the road. We're truly going to seek to understand. We're going to seek clarity, understanding. It's being empathetic. If we could look through the lenses and filters of their eyes, what do they see and how do we communicate in a relevant way? Avoid figurative language. I mentioned I did a spot called War on Cancer when I started at the Cancer Center. And in English, I scripted something that said we're going toe-to-toe with cancer. It's a military term. It's a combat term. It's literally going eye to eye, one-on-one with an opponent in a fight. When it was translated to Spanish, it came out something loosely that said foot to foot. And fortunately for me, the team that I was working with had, they were good partners of mine, and they came back and said, Michael, we can literally translate this. It doesn't translate well, but it's going to have zero relevance to your intended audience. So they helped me create a message that was impactful. So we need to watch and eliminate idioms, that figurative language. We also need to watch nonverbal communication. And I'll give you an example of this. About 25 years ago, my wife and I were on our honeymoon. We're in Jamaica. We're going scuba diving for the first time. We've got some international folks, the crew that was going scuba diving with us. There were 2 American couples. And our dive master, who's given us our training, was from Canada. Good news, she speaks English. And she looked at my wife and I and another American couple, and she says, all right, if we're underwater, and we use sign language, this is how you communicate underwater, and I ask you, are you okay? I mean, she's just gonna give us one of these. She says, I can't have you Americans going, all right, I'm doing fantastic, give me the thumbs up, because this means surface. And if I just asked you if you're okay, this tells me that we need to go up because something's wrong, and you and I are gonna have a conversation above the water. Something recently I just learned is this sign, which probably means okay to you and I, is offensive in certain cultures. So we need to recognize nonverbal communication and what is gonna cut through. Being succinct, and the reason I mention this, if we long talk something, we are going to insert, most likely, figurative language or possibly slang, but we could also unintentionally insert cultural bias. So keep our messaging as tight as possible, and then choose the appropriate channel. Mike was talking about this as he was talking about the different generations of our Hispanic population. It's true for us when we communicate. If we're communicating to Gen Z or millennials, you can guarantee it's going to be digital. Not that others don't use those means as well. They're probably not reading the local paper. Something we found when we were doing COVID mitigation communications this last year was that our Hispanics community, particularly the Spanish-speaking friends of ours, they were really utilizing radio, tapping into that. And it was a great medium for us to communicate. Well, as we're working to reach out to our community, one of the things that Visit does is we're very conscious of trying to represent our community in an authentic way, but making sure we have spokespeople that'll speak and influence people that really are representative of their communities. So from July of last year to about June of this year, we had contracts with the counties and the cities doing COVID mitigation communications. Lots of communications for Benton Franklin Health District. Didn't have our name on it, but we were doing the creative development, scripting, and a lot of the production. This is a piece that we did. We reached out to a friend of ours named Isaac Butts to help us carry this message forward. I'm only going to show you a snippet of it in the interest of time, but here you go.
This is a mask. It's used to cover things. This is you. These are your air holes. COVID-19 is transmitted through your air holes. Cover your air holes. CYA.
CYA. So I mentioned earlier that humor doesn't necessarily translate, particularly when we're using an acronym like CYA. So we developed this commercial, and I tapped into the talents of my team. So this is Hector Cruz. This is actually a screenshot taken from a Spanish language commercial we produced. And I asked Hector, I said, Hector, will this translate? And I don't mean literal translation, but will it be relevant? He says, Michael, I don't think it will. And I said, we have any thoughts? We need to do something creative that's going to cut through. And he reached out into his network to somebody I know that he had a relationship with that I'm pretty certain is on this call, Gracie Valle. And so the two of them, Gracie and Hector, came up with this campaign called Dichos. And if I'm telling the story right, it's Dichos translates to sayings. It's as the saying goes, it's these pearls of wisdom that moms and dads and grandma and grandpas impart upon their youth. And it's very relevant for our Spanish-speaking friends. I want to show you just a little snippet of the work that Hector and Gracie came up with.
Escuchen, como dice el dicho, haz el bien sin mirar a quién. ¿Qué crees? El vecino tiene el coronavirus. Él fue a la quinceañera de María, al bautizo de José y a la graduación de Jesús. No lo conozco, pero pobrecito, hubiera usado una máscara y no estar de fiesta en fiesta.
So I won't run you through all of that. That last person speaking is Maria, who's also on my team, so tapping into internal talent. Here's the beauty of what Gracie and Hector came up with. If we had some young people watching TV and this commercial came on, they might remember that mom, dad, grandma, grandpa just literally presented them with the dicho. If mom, dad, grandma, grandpa see the spot, they may have thought to themselves, I just sat the kiddos down and we're imparting pearls of wisdom, or even better, we might tap into a little bit of nostalgia and they remember when they were kids and their parents or grandparents were presenting these sayings to them as well. So it resonates, it's relevant. So taking us full circle and tying a bow on this thing, we truly do need to make an investment in understanding culture. I feel one of the best ways we can do that is developing partners within those cultures, within those communities. They act as our tour guides and help us understand the landscape, how we can be successful. Tap into your internal talent. Hopefully we're all building diverse teams, and this provides great avenues, not only with their talent, but their networks, using those appropriate channels. So we make sure that we craft this incredible message that it actually is firing on all cylinders and it's connecting with the intended party. Proactively creating feedback loops. So seeking out, how are we doing? Did that message resonate? Was it on point? And if not, we have the opportunity to come back, refine, do it again, and repeat that process. When I say we need to be present, it goes back to what Albert Torres tells me. You need to show up. People need to be familiar if we're going to develop trust. And that means investing in endeavors, not just at the time of need, but planning to be in that space and really working relationships. And if we can do that and we're communicating effectively, we're going to build trust. And if we build trust, we have the opportunity to develop collaborative relationships across our communities and do some incredible things for the Tri-Cities. So that's what I had for you today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. That was entertaining to say the least. I worked for a while at St. Pat's and encountered some of those, well, that's not going to translate over properly to our congregation. So thank you for that reminder and that insight. Mike, I want to take it back to you. Michael shared some of his successes and some of his failures and some of his personal experiences. You were really open with us on your strategy when you started with the city of Pasco. Would you mind sharing some of the successes and maybe learning moments for you that you've encountered either here in the city of Pasco or throughout your career?
Yeah, I would say, in the city space and at Franklin PUD, I really haven't experienced any failures, but I think it's probably because of my previous failures and some of my other endeavors. And, I took some notes of what Michael was saying, and Michael's so great. He really is so on point with all his data. And the one thing I wrote a note for myself, trust, and that's such a huge thing in particular in the Hispanic community, if you're trying to market in that space. And I think the other thing that he mentioned was the cultural competency piece is so huge. I run a food blog, which is called Hispanic Food Network. So I've had this food blog for 12 years now, and it's relatively successful. We average right around 50,000 visitors per month. I do have partners in the endeavor. We generate anywhere from $1,000 to $3,000 in Google ads per month. We're really consistent on our content creation. We initially started out as a television production show where we went around the Northwest. It was called In La Cocina, but we have always done our content in English to a broad audience, keeping in mind that, everybody is going to consume this. But so I think one of the failures that I learned or have learned out of Hispanic Food Network is that, in particular in the Hispanic community, you really have to have that cultural competence, especially when it comes to food, because that certainly is something that's revered in the Hispanic culture. So for instance, when I first began the endeavor, I'm somewhat of a foodie, but I don't know everything about Latin food. I grew up in Miami loving Cuban and Puerto Rican food. So, as I got into it, I learned in particular a whole lot about Mexican culture. So let's say you post something about a Mexican dish, and I know Michael loves Mexican food, so he could relate to this. So there was a few times early in my career, you'd post something about a new Mexican recipe inside, let's say that the dish is really from Mexico City, Mexico, or vice versa. Or if I'm posting about Puerto Ricans and I say they like, Cuban style tostones, you talk about cultural incompetence and how you will get called out. So, as the Tri-Cities in particular transforms, what I'm seeing is there's more people from Central America. We have Cubans here. We have Puerto Ricans in the Tri-Cities. The predominant culture from a Hispanic standpoint is Mexican, but did you guys know that 60% of the Mexicans in Franklin County have ties to Colima? So there is such a Colima connection that you need to know about if you're a marketer or a public relations person. So what I've learned over the years is that you really have to know the regions, you have to know the people, you have to know the cultures, and that's something that I've had to educate myself during my time in Pasco, because when you learn about Mexico, Mexico has states, and states really have certain cultural aspects to them that people bring with them. So, and that means a lot to people. So, I think, regardless if you know Spanish or not, if you understand the cultural context, you will gain that trust. And I'll say that, the Hispanic culture in particular is a very trusting, one-on-one, face-to-face culture. So, once you're trusted in that community, whether you're a public relations firm, an individual that's working by yourself, or you're part of an agency like ours, it takes a lot of work. What I've had to do, and based on the lessons that I've learned, just trying to gain trust in the business community. One of my core focuses is downtown Pasco. And, we certainly have some issues in downtown Pasco with trust, with factions that are built up there, with, lack of trust of DPDA and their effectiveness. So what I have literally had to do is go door to door to door since June. The day I walked into the door was visit each one of those businesses. And I've visited each business probably multiple times in that downtown core, so they can get to know me, they can get to trust me. They have my cell number, they can call me anytime. So it really takes some legwork, in particular in the Hispanic community. So, and you've got to be willing to do that, regardless if you know Spanish or not. And my Spanish, I always say, is pretty good and conversational. So don't be afraid to go in and flex your Spanish muscles. Hispanics are some of the most inviting people in the world, and if you attempt to speak their language, they will appreciate that 100 times over. I can tell you that. So don't be embarrassed of your Spanish. I'll say some of the obstacles that I've faced over my career, in particular in the public service space. It's the language barriers. Certainly. And I'll talk from a Tri-Cities perspective and a Franklin County and Pasco perspective. English and Spanish are the predominant languages. So again, I think it's that cultural competence and really knowing that your audience is, primarily from Mexico, and a large portion of the people in the city of Pasco, English is not their first language. So for the folks out there that don't know Spanish, make sure that you have someone in-house that knows how to speak Spanish. Then also, the subtext of that is I've seen situations where people, let's say they're native from Cuba, and they translate to people that are from Mexico. It doesn't always translate. So again, to Michael's point, you have to know your audience. You have to have that cultural competence. So really know your audience is the number one thing that I could get across to you guys. Well, also, just to give you a nugget, if you're from the Tri-Cities or maybe from the region, a group that we've used a little bit at Franklin PUD, I haven't used them here yet, is Miss Flowers Interpreters. So they're really good. If you run an agency or you're a person that does public relations and you need translation services, they do a fantastic job. So they can be a real resource for you. And I can throw their website address in the chat box. But really, those are really the challenges, Jess, that I've had over the years, is just, making sure that I'm really disciplined and I understand who my audience is and how we communicate to them in the most effective manner.
Well, I'm Senora Stich, my Spanish teacher from Pasco High several decades ago, will be glad to know that I have enough of the welcoming communication to go in and be friendly. So she'll appreciate that I've given permission to dust off that every now and again.
Oh, for sure. People should try.
It makes a huge difference. On the topic of language, Mike, this question is still directed at you. And Michael, please feel free to add on at the end. A Latina California Assemblywoman, has recently been quoted as saying the term Latinx is something that a lot of white progressives use. And a now 2-year-old Pew survey found that only 25% of Latinos had heard the term Latinx, and 80% of those people preferred not to use it. Here in the Tri-Cities, what term would you recommend we use for the general Hispanic and Latino audiences?
Oh, this is one of those tough debates, and it's one that I faced with my food blog because we named it the Hispanic Food Network. So I tell you, we probably get 5 emails a month saying that that should not be the name. So, you know, this is certainly a fight that's gone on for quite a while. And I'll just kind of give you some context to it. So, I mean, this is one argument that people for the pro-Hispanic side, you know, Hispanics derive their origins from Spain and the Iberia Peninsula. You'll hear that quite a bit. Where on the other spectrum, Latinos are made up of people from the Caribbean, Mexico, South Americans who in many cases have indigenous blood. So, you know, Latinx, that's a term that's come about recently. And I would say in particular, the old schoolers that I talk to are like, we are not hip with that. So, you know, there's kind of a youth movement on that one. And some of the data that I've seen, right around 3% of people are identifying themselves as Latinx. You know, me personally, I prefer to use the word Hispanic just because, you know, right now that it's what's in the census. And I think people get that. You know, they understand it's sort of an all-encompassing phrase. But I don't think it's wrong to use Latino either. So I really say it's the preference of the person. I've chosen to use Hispanic Food Network for my blog because it works. You know, and it becomes such a political, divisive issue that there's not a whole lot you can say on that in terms of what's right or what's wrong. So I think it's really what feels good to that individual. And if it's a term that they want to use, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But you will have some people that will push back on the word Hispanic. So I know I kind of left it in the gray area, which is where it always seems to go. But me personally, if I had to choose one, I would choose Hispanic.
Wonderful. Thank you. Michael, did you have anything to add to that from your greater Tri-City perspective?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So years ago, I was running my family's business, and we had one of our staff was of Mexican heritage, and I was trying to find my way on the appropriate phrase to use, term to use, and I said Hispanic, and he looked at me. He said, "Show me Hispanic on the map." He goes, "I'm Mexican." He was really proud of his Mexican heritage. So then Hector on my team, he and I have had this conversation as I'm trying to navigate this and understand what's most appropriate. For me, I kind of figure if the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, if it's good for them, it's good for me. But Hector and I had this very same conversation about Latinos and Latinx. And it was when I first started to see Latinx used. And rich conversation, but I think Mike really cued into something. I think going back to Hector and my conversation, it was a little more inclusive to all of these cultures, that if we wanted to really put them under the umbrella, maybe it captured everything, but that's not necessarily satisfying to all. And I think what Mike was teeing up on is what is most appropriate to those people we're communicating with. So I think it's fair to ask. I mean, it's awkward. I've had that same struggle, whether it was in our Black community, African-American community. And I think most people would give you some grace if you're trying to find your way there. Much like Mike said, if you're trying to flex your using your Spanish language muscle, there's a little grace in that space.
Wonderful. Well, we are coming up on our 12:45 mark here. So before we open this up to our Q&A, I want just to touch on something. We promised our attendees that we would provide them with some real world tactics. Mike, you kind of teased at some of our toolbox attributes as being our best features. So kind of a rapid fire, gentlemen. Michael, we'll start with you since your face is nice and big in front of me here. What are a couple of tactics that comms pros can use tomorrow or this afternoon in reaching across the bridges of our communities here?
Yeah, it was kind of that hit list that I had thrown up on the slide, understand culture, but develop those partners, reach out to you just start with a single advocate that can act as your tour guide, probably the biggest thing you can do. And then don't miss that opportunity to tap into your internal talent, relevant messaging. I mean, on down the list, but all these things will ladder up to trust. But it's that cultural understanding and grab somebody that can help guide you in that journey. That would be my number one.
Wonderful. Thank you. Mike, how about you?
Just I would say have confidence that you're the expert and leverage that. And I think in this day and age, really utilize the content creation tools that are out there to create your own star power, if you will. I mean, everybody in this room has something to offer. So I would say there's tools out there. Use Zoom to create interviews for your clients so you can create your YouTube page. In order to get into the media, get to know the reporters in your area. A lot of people do not watch local news, but they'll get on their Facebook page. I often go to Keepers. They have 100,000 followers, and the engagement that Tom, the news director, gets is just incredible. Make sure that you get to know those news directors. Make sure you get to know those reporters, and really get some value for your clients. Get to know the weekend reporters at the 3 TV stations. They are desperate for content. I know. I was a news director, so if you develop those relationships, to Michael's point, I really think that's the key to bringing value to your clients. It's really those relationships, knowing that you're the expert, and there's tools out there that are absolutely free that you can create your own podcast, your own vlogcast, and really position yourself as the expert, and people will follow you and listen to you because you guys certainly are. And I know sometimes it's hard to step out there and do those kind of things, but I think once you do that, come up with a consistent content creation plan, I really believe it's going to pay off.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to remind everyone, we do have the chat box and some time set aside for some questions. So I encourage all of you, if you have any questions for our 2 presenters today, please feel free to chime in. I've got, as I said, Mr. P back there manning it from the back end. I did see the hand raise function at some point early on in our presentation. So I'm encouraging you, if you'd like to chime in with a question, now's your chance to do it. And while we wait for any questions to come in, gentlemen, do you have any final wisdom to impart as we give these attendees an opportunity to chime in?
That's good. I'll share something we did at the Cancer Center, and it really is, to Mike's point. So we recognize that the media is looking for stories, right? So we'd actively pitch. But what we did is we hosted an annual media appreciation day, and we bought them lunch, we gave them swag, and it wasn't just the reporters or the GMs, it was the crews. We had a lot of people that would show up because it takes a lot of people to run those teams to produce that content. And we wanted to know that we really appreciated them, particularly for us as we were working to curb the tide of disease in our community, get this detected early, and hopefully beat cancer when we can. They were key advocates for us. So I for me, it's love on the media, but they're looking for your stories.
Wonderful. Mike, you have anything for us?
Yeah, just to build on that, if you guys are out there and run a PR firm, or you're in a government agency like my own, I mean, you really have to think about those angles every single day that really puts your agency in the spotlight. I mean, especially if you're trying to rebrand and you're trying to build your agency's credibility. And to build on that, I do think that what's really helped me over my career is to have a brand for any agency that I'm working with. When I was in the news business, we rebranded when I was at Cap KView. I really think it gives you the guidance. So and a lot has to do with timing at the time. It was, President Trump was calling local news fake. So, we went on the mantra, real stories, real people, real news. And it kind of gave us a guide wire to, everything we presented in the news. Did it have a hard edge value? Was it breaking? in the Hispanic Food Network space, when we write about our food and we write about our chefs in there, our mantra is we're always authentic. So we know we have to stay within those parameters. We're not going to go to a run-of-the-mill Mexican restaurant or even a chain restaurant, because our audience is just, they're not for that. If I posted something from Taco Bell or from what's another one of those joints, I mean, they would literally, I'd hear about it instantly. And I think in regards to the city of Pasco, all the content I produce, I look at it from this lens. Pasco is on the rise. How do I position that in every content piece that I produce to make sure that I'm presenting Pasco in the most positive light that we possibly can get it? Because over the years, we haven't gotten that. When I started, you Google Pasco and Antonio Zambrano shooting comes up, redistricting, all these sort of negative connotation things. So how do we get into that space where when people think of Pasco, that we're on the rise? So I think if you don't have a brand for your company or for the agency that you're working on, you need to start working on that.
Wonderful. Thank you all for chiming in with some questions. We had a couple come in while you were talking. Along those lines of building a brand and giving yourself a direction, Gracie wanted to know, what is your favorite strategy to engage or inform with the Latino and Hispanic communities here?
I'll take a shot. We just literally we're shooting with a local business owner. We did the spot in Spanish. We have a weekly YouTube video series that we put out called Tri-Cities Business Spotlight. And this is the first time we've actually done it in Spanish, but I parked a link to an article I referenced earlier. It was a little known story of Black workers in a secret city. Tanya Bowers, if any of you happen to know her, she's Martin Valadez's wife, had said something to me one day, and I thought it was perfect. And it was, let them, these populations, these communities that we're working to engage, let them tell their stories, right? And what we're doing with Tri-Cities Spotlight is we're hearing directly from these business owners of the people that make these businesses so unique. And so I think, particularly as we're looking at our Spanish-speaking population or the Hispanic population at large, hearing their stories from their lens of what's of value, and it's culturally enriching for me.
Absolutely. Mike, how about you?
Yeah, when I think about how we engage with the Hispanic community, I really think it depends on the audience that we're talking to. So the older Hispanics, it's really traditional face-to-face, traditional media sources like Michael mentioned. Radio is absolutely huge. And I made a note to myself, marketing to the Hispanic community, this is what I hear often, especially from the more acculturated Hispanic that doesn't necessarily speak Spanish. Stop trying to speak Spanish. Somebody actually told this to me once. Stop trying to speak Spanish to me. I don't know Spanish. So some of the feedback that I was getting was, I am Hispanic, but don't, act like I'm my grandmother, that watches Univision all day. So I feel like Hispanics, they want to be marketed to in English if Spanish is not the primary use language. I've definitely seen that in the Hispanic Food Network. I've definitely seen that in my city and Franklin PED times. So they want to consume their media in English, but I think the nuance in it all, and I'm sure Michael will say the same thing, is it's okay to have a Hispanic feel or Mexican feel or Puerto Rican feel or Cuban feel, but you don't have to speak to me in Spanish because it comes off like the guys from the hospital that were, with the mouth over, with the Spanish over it. So as long as you're careful and respectful, I think it'll be a win.
Mike, were you being critical of my commercial?
No, I wasn't. I actually liked it a lot because being from Miami, I totally got it. I liked it a lot, but I totally could see where it could tick a few people off if you weren't in the mood.
Oh, you could slay it. You could slay it. It was sure. Years.
Yeah.
So we've got one more question and about 5 minutes left. That really plays off, Mike, of your conversation of, yeah, we're Mexican, but I want you to speak English to me. A question came in that do you see the impact or a change of multiracial couples, of as these generations are here in the Tri-Cities longer, here in the United States longer, how is that changing the communication methods and our strategy in general for these new families, these new communities? How do you see that changing?
Did you direct that at Mike or me? I'm sorry.
Either one of you.
Oh yeah, I thought. Go ahead, Michael. I thought she said Michael too. So.
Yeah, so interesting. So it may be that the things that develop when we look at culture for some of these folks, particularly as we get third, fourth generation, and we've got multicultural relationships, the things that would have been traditional to Mexican culture may not apply, but their likes and interests related to other things that make us unique may very much apply. So maybe their families, they have kids and they have kids that love sports, and the sports they love is soccer. That might be the thing. So we'll hyper target depending on who we're chasing down. And with digital media, we've got great tools to understand who we're speaking to, what they value, and where they're spending money as we're looking to drive economic impact. So that might be the piece that we're leveraging in those instances.
Wonderful. How about you, Mike? Are you seeing a shift?
Yeah, what I've seen, and I really view this quite a bit through my Hispanic Food Network lens more than the city perspective, because what I've seen is, especially when you see someone who's of mixed race, whether it's half Mexican or half Puerto Rican or half Cuban, there's almost like a heavier nostalgic feel for it, to be a part of that culture, because I feel like it sort of gives that person some uniqueness in a sense, and they want to hold on to that. And I think there's, in some senses, a lot of value that they put on that because that is part of who they are. So, from a marketing perspective, Michael could probably tell you more how he goes about it. But the way I look at it was, if we're giving people that really authentic feel and sticking to our brand, that they're going to gravitate to our content, and it's going to give them a good feeling. So I think what I found in marketing, it's more about feeling than sometimes, the actual content itself. You want it to be really high level, but if you're hitting the mark with the authenticity of it, whatever space you're in, if you're hitting the mark in that regard, and in particular to that question, I feel like it's another opportunity to market to somebody that has a different perspective, because maybe they're, half Caucasian, half Mexican. So, there's different opportunities. And I think in some senses, they have a broader outlook of the world because they have to deal in two different worlds. I know I'm half white and half Hispanic. So I totally understand that world where one half of my family really white, the other all Puerto Rican. So, the family get-togethers are interesting. So I kind of have that understanding of people who have that mixed race feel.
Wonderful. Well, as a first generation half Dutch American, I can understand that wholeheartedly. Well, gentlemen, we are coming up on our 1 o'clock mark. I'd really like to thank you for joining us today. Those of you who joined us for our chapter presentation, thank you so much for taking the time on this Tuesday lunch break to join us. I'd like to encourage everyone to mark your calendars for our October presentation. It will be on October 12th at noon right here on Zoom. We will be joined by a new PNNL rock star named Rasit Harat. He will be presenting on the 5 digital marketing trends that you don't want to ignore in 2022. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn for up-to-date information on these presentations. And again, a huge thank you to Mike and Michael for joining us. It's been lots of fun. And Mike, here's to Little League season in the spring.
Hey, we'll see you next season. Should be fun. This is awesome. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you all for joining us.